Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today to speak to you. I suppose I have a confession to make, which is although I'm from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, I'm not an accountant. So there's the first British paradox for you. And I saw this wonderfully broad title, The Role of Ecosystems, and I really didn't know how to address it. So I thought, well, actually, one of the interesting things about our institute is that when it was incorporated, we were given an overriding public interest role. So our duty to serve the public is greater than our duty to serve our members. And so I thought, well, I will take a public interest role approach to ecosystem services, and perhaps having seen the wonderful presentations of my colleagues today, I would just offer up some thoughts around the challenges that we in the business world face and that we must address if we're going to get this right. What is the public interest when it comes to ecosystems? And I thought, well, actually, the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals provide us, given the enormous inquiry that the UN went through in order to achieve these, provide us with a fairly clear articulation of what the world wants to see by 2030, and are a fairly good description of what the public interest is. And in terms of ecosystems, in terms of the sea, they are about conserving and maintaining the use of the oceans, and on land, protecting and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, managing forests, combating deforestation, and halting and reversing land degradation, and halting biodiversity. And of course, we can't see the goals in isolation. We see them as a whole. And that articulation of the whole sees a very strong connection between humanity and nature, and emphasises the importance of socially and economically just societies, all existing within planetary limits. These are very much social norms about the importance of ecosystems and nature, rather than market norms about the monetary value of them. Many, from Ban Ki-moon downwards, have argued of a huge role that business has to play in achieving these goals. The Sustainable Development Goals themselves, estimates are enormous, but will cost upwards of $800 billion a year. And with publicly available funds being a fraction of that, it's clear that civil society and business has a huge role to play. But I think, and here's the first challenge, I think for business, the license this gives us, we have to handle with care. We have to abandon the narrow view of the connection between business and society, and business and the environment, that hardened with the Chicago School and the formulation of neoclassical economics that defined business simply in terms of profit, and move to one that perhaps we could talk about as purpose, where business plays a greater role in driving forward the issues that we face today around nature and the environment and our ecosystems, if it is not to be seen as self-serving, if we are not to be seen as caring, as uncaring about only what we achieve and not about sustainability and other public interest goals. That requires, and comes to a kind of second change, really implicit in that, is a huge change in behaviour. If the world we envisage is one that is a prosperous and socially just world within environmental limits, I would actually argue that we cannot achieve that within our current economic and business models. This isn't just something I've dreamed up in the Institute of Chartered Accountants and without bursting into flames and committing heresy. The Harvard Business Review article by Porter and Kramer points out that society increasingly sees capitalism as the source of its ills. A big part of the problem with this lies with the companies themselves, which remain trapped in an outdated approach to value creation that has emerged over the past decades. They continue to view value creation narrowly, optimising short-term financial performance in a bubble while missing the most important customer needs and ignoring the broader influences that determine their long-term success. How else could companies overlook the well-being of their customers, the depletion of natural resources vital to their businesses, the viability of their key suppliers, the economic distress of the communities in which they produce and sell? And it's not just academics that are arguing this. Ian Cheshire, when chief executive of Kingfisher, wrote in The Guardian, Infinite high resource intensity growth is simply not possible. And we are already living off our future capital. It may be gradual, but most businesses will have to adjust to a very different reality. That reality will still be a version of capitalism. It needs to be positive rather than a doom-laden return to the Stone Age. But it really needs to think the point of the system. Instead of a goal of maximising linear growth in GDP, we should be thinking of maximising well-being and minimal planetary input. That starts to challenge the businesses to go beyond efficiency gains, although they are important, and really redesign their business models. The problem we face is that is a small group of people. And the challenge for us is how do we bring the rest of our community with us? Underlying these assumptions are that it's a notion that was fixed in the nature of the way we think, which is, this is how I do things, this is how my business operates, this is how the economy runs. What shall I do about those collapsing ecosystems and those breached environmental limits? We need to reverse that. We need to say, we face an environmental crisis. How do we change our business model? How do we change our economic model to achieve that? And I think the phrase, the role of ecosystem services, to my mind, reinforces this old world vision. One which places a flow of value from nature to business without inviting a question, what services do we need to deliver back to nature? Even the phrase payment for ecosystem services describes delivering payment to a third party for their ecosystem, which without any repayment to the ecosystem itself or consideration of it. This then brings me to my next, and I think one of the most vexed dilemmas we face, and that is the dilemma of valuation. Pavan Sukhdev, who I think I was kind of substituted in for, so I can do my Pavan impersonation now. Pavan said... Oh, fantastic. Yes, well, I'm very humbled, in fact, to be such a great man's substitute. But anyway, one of the things that he said is that we use nature because it's valuable, and we lose it because it's free. And those who bear the biggest burden of the cost are those least able to afford it, the poor. That is a dynamic that is destined to shatter. So one endeavour is how do we take account of nature? One way is to put a value on it. And that has been done with great success. If one looks at Costa Rica, that is an enormously successful example of how putting a value on nature has turned around things. However, let's just take a step back for a minute and think. From the moment that we move from a narrative description of an ecosystem or a natural landscape to a measurement of it, to a quantification of it, to a valuation of it, we start to omit things, not because they're irrelevant or immaterial, to use a accounting phrase, but because we can't measure them and we can't value them. We're in danger, and I exaggerate to make my point, we're in danger of ending up with a valuation that excludes everything we find valuable. Now, in 1968, Robert Kennedy, campaigning for the US presidency, said exactly the same about GDP. More than 40 years later, we really do have to learn this lesson. We should note that there are also conceptual challenges to valuation. There is a body of argument that says that we should not put a valuation on nature. That simply commoditizes it and diminishes it. In other words, it drives out that social norm, those social norms that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals, and replaces them with market norms that corrode them. For establishing financial markets in offsets and tradable permits, and creating legal structures that privatize ecosystems and make possible their legal ownership so that their goods and services can be entered the market, diminishes their importance and makes them just as tradable as anything else. And just because something is not quantifiable does not mean it is important. A position that privileges something that can be measured places quantity over quality, and I think most of us would find that questionable. They have to accept that there are some things we cannot measure, although we value them: truth, justice, freedom. And it is the same with nature. As I've said somewhere else, and in other places, I think a lot of the articulation of a concern about valuing nature from civil society is a deeper expression of a concern that business is not a good steward of nature. We haven't the legitimacy yet. We haven't demonstrated that we can look after the planet. And whilst many businesses have acted very responsibly, collectively, it would be difficult for us to argue that we as a business community have looked after nature. So one of our challenges is to build our mandate and our licence in this space. And from that comes the argument of, well, who should value nature? Should it be left in the hands of service providers and consultants? Should it be in the hands of those interested parties? The people who actually own most of the valuable ecosystems are people in the developing world. Many of those people do not place a monetary value, do not consider nature in terms of that. Many consider it in terms of a spiritual connection to their ancestors. And a piece of thought leadership that we commissioned from Dario Kenna points out that in India, where indigenous people successfully overcame the development of a bauxite mine on the basis of its religious and spiritual value. We cannot postpone the question of who should value nature while we discuss if, because the who will be determining of how it's done. How we decide who should value nature and whose values should be taken into account is about the exercise of power and whose interests are taken into account. Language is an important part here as well. We use language to distance ourselves and to colonise nature. Capital is not a term of art in science, in civil society or conservation. Capital is a term of art in business. Ecosystem services, the idea of services, again, it's a language that describes, it's a language that starts to colonise nature for the purposes of business, and we need to be careful that as a business community we aren't simply seen to be occupying, colonising the space of nature, but by the use of our language. It also reinforces a debate. The debate reinforces our distance and separates us from nature. If we think back to a Judeo-Christian tradition, God created man and gave him dominion over nature. The Garden of Eden is not a wilderness, it is a maintained landscape. And the language we use is one of protection, cultivation, preservation and resource. These are the language of control, not involvement. And what's interesting is that for as long as we keep to separate ourselves from nature, we don't see ourselves as part of that system or a subsystem of it. And if we did, perhaps we would see ourselves as self-harming, and perhaps we might take a different view on what we're doing. And a final point, I've got 2 minutes, so a final point is representation. A set of accounts is a representation. And representations, by definition, no matter how naturalistic they are, and the more naturalistic they are, the more we kid ourselves that they are the thing itself. They are simply a representation. They leave things out and they guide our perception. And I think, therefore, as a sort of finishing point, there is a moment for the accountancy profession here, which is to create a new vision, which guides different perception and helps businesses to make different decisions. Following COP10 in Nagoya, The Guardian wrote a piece. So it's will accountants save the world? Doubt it, but still. So it has come to this. The global biodiversity crisis is so severe that brilliant scientists, political leaders, eco-warriors, religious gurus can no longer save us from ourselves. The military is powerless, but there may be one last hope for life on Earth, the accountants. And he goes on to talk about the invisibility of nature and the importance the profession plays. But he finishes, and I think this is the dilemma for us all. Eco-accounting alone cannot solve everything, but I will watch with great interest how these initiatives develop. Making them work will require boring things like measuring, standard setting, regulating and checking. But the potential consequences are enormous. Done badly, they could mean the natural world is further commodified, priced, sliced and sold to the highest bidder. Done well, they could reset human values and, who knows, perhaps transform capitalism more than they transform the natural world. That is what I believe summarises the dilemma and the opportunity for us all. Thank you.
from the very beginning started to address the risk that we are facing in using that concept, namely of commodifying nature. I would like to ask you if you have any questions directly relating to Richard's speech. Anyone? Any questions? Come on. That can mean that your presentation was perfect. There. First row, I didn't see it, sorry. Can you please also say your name and where you come from?
Yeah, I am Mitzi Polisco from the Philippines. I just would like to get your idea with regard to the parameters, the indicators, definite, specific, unquestionably justifiable when it comes to its very specific to certain industries, certain sectors. Because in our part of the world, in the developing world, there are actually questions already of how are you going to quantify a certain protected area as it, having to mine a certain portion of it because of prior rights. And so things like that, something like how, if it is more, if the value of the ecosystem services that it's going to produce will be more than the value of the mining, which has prior rights, how will it be solved, something like.
So the question is, how do you resolve, how do you set the parameters for deciding on between two positions?
That's why what happens is that the companies, they are actually asking for specific indicators, because they say, I am actually an environmental consultant. I do environmental impact assessments and due diligence and all sorts of things. It's like they are really actually at a loss of particular indicators that will really put that particular value into application, that particular indicator into application, such that, say, if it's just for watershed alone, for pollination, for things like agricultural use of that particular watershed, and how do we put them into specific values, like such that it is attributable to that particular watershed, something like.
So how do you actually kind of put a value on some of these things?
Pardon me?
Is it how you put a value on?
I am putting it into. I'm asking you of your opinion about that.
I mean, I think that what I was trying to say is I think it's incredibly difficult, and the temptation is to go for almost a reductivist position, because what you're trying to balance is so complex. And I kind of, my get out of jail free card for myself was, it's really hard, isn't it? But I think that what you've seen in some cases, so the case in India was around the value of a bauxite mine, as opposed to the spiritual value of the place to the people who existed there, and the local authority, the government, the regional government, in the end, came down very heavily on the side of that actually the spiritual value to the people who lived there was more valuable than it was to mine the place. Now, you can very easily put a financial value on the bauxite and the extraction of the bauxite, and you can even very simply put a figure around the restoration of that. But for the indigenous peoples of that place, once once that ground had been disturbed, its spiritual value had been destroyed completely. So it wasn't possible to quantify it. So in the end, it was completely a qualitative, values-driven decision.
One more question from the floor.
Yes, hello. I'm Eva Furman from the Finnish Environment Institute. And the discussion you just had with the lady in the front row is very interesting. And I would also like to take up the same issue about the valuation. Actually, we do need valuation, but it doesn't mean that we need to do it on monetary basis. And at the moment, there's huge amount of research being done by developing different kind of methods for valuation, because valuation means that how do people see the importance of something. And so when we are talking about it in a very ethical way, it's nice to say that we only need narratives, but when we are talking about decision-making and planning, where you really have to rank different things, then you need some kind of valuation. And luckily there are deliberative methods that are now under development, where you actually link and combine different kind of methods so that they suit the situation. But I do understand, and it came up really clearly, that it is a very difficult task, and that's why this development is taking place. And I think we really are going to reach somewhere, because without having any kind of value or meaning for things, it's very difficult to make decisions.
I don't disagree with that, and I certainly wouldn't say that I'm kind of here on an anti-valuation ticket. I mean, of course, it's important, but the point I was making is that we have to recognise that there are many people who don't agree with that, and you can't just simply ignore. We as a business community can't just pretend it doesn't exist. And that within valuation itself, people would view from outside the accountancy profession that valuation in financial terms is dead easy, but it's not. It's highly complicated and very subjective. And so I'm simply saying that whilst we absolutely embrace valuation and should do, we need to be very careful and recognise that others don't. So that, for instance, if you were in a South Pacific island and you started talking about valuation, the people there would just think you were mad. Because their whole world perception is that they only have meaning in terms of their connection with the landscape they live in. And how could you even begin to value that? So, we come at it from a different perspective. It's absolutely right that we frame things in our own terms, and valuation has a massive and important role. What I'm saying is that we need to recognise that there are other frames of reference and other worldviews in which this is meaningless. It would be like going to a country and speaking a different language and expecting to be understood. That's what the English do all the time, but still.
Thank you.